Yeah, great. Welcome all. And go ahead and begin our conversation as we continue to get settled. I'm Kate Cagney. I'm the director of the Institute for Social Research. And today I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Ethan Kross, psychologist, author, researcher. Does it feel like there's a little bit of feedback there? That's going to get fixed back here magically in a moment. And I'm going to emphasize the Research Center for Group Dynamics because it's here in ISR, but Ethan also has appointments in psychology in Ross. He's trained at both Penn and Columbia. And we're going to engage in a conversation today about his new book, Shift. Here it is. Managing your emotions so they don't manage you. And I've been a big fan of Ethan's work for a very long time. And in fact, I tried to recruit Ethan to the University of Chicago because I thought the work was so engaging. And I was joining with colleagues in psychology to think about how he could make a life at Chicago. And I failed to recruit Ethan.
So we brought you here.
So I had to move here instead so that I could learn about his work and collaborate with him and think about the ways in which the work that Ethan's engaged in can change our science at the Institute for Social Research. And one of the things we're going to primarily focus on the book, but we're also going to talk about the Institute for Mental Fitness and your vision for that and the extent to which ISR right, is central in helping to incubate that work. So I want to say a bit about Shift. And does people read the book, own the book? It looks like this.
Everyone has clearly read it. There's no
right.
question about it.
And you can run out to Literati. Tom picked it up the other day there, but you said it was the last copy, right? Yeah, that's a good problem, right? So, but you know that
I like that frame.
But what Ethan does in Shift is he offers what we would consider a science-based guide to understanding our emotions. I like this as not as enemies to be controlled, but as tools that can help us thrive. And I really like this notion that how do we think about our emotions working for us rather than against us? And rather than sort of tamping down things or thinking, I shouldn't feel anxious, all right? I shouldn't feel nervous. I have to sort of level out. What are the ways in which these signals are so informative and can really help us navigate and achieve goals rather than in some way, right, act as a barrier. And so that's why I think these insights are so critical for us. I do want to note just that we'll be in conversation for about 40 minutes and then we'll leave time for questions. At the end, I'm really interested in how you react to this work. We're recording the session, so for those who didn't make the RSVP list, which was capping at 90 today, there'll be recordings of this series. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ethan Kross. So I referred to the arc of your work earlier. And Shift itself builds on your longstanding work in psychology, emotional regulation. Why are these topics important to all of us and in our daily lives?
Well, I think of these questions of emotion and how we can manage them effectively as these timeless, universal struggles that afflict us all. Let me ask folks here, how many people here have had occasion to manage an emotion in some way over the past week? Show of hands. Okay, that's everyone. How about today? It's almost everyone. And, maybe to jump to the conclusion of what we were going to talk about from the start, but I just find it remarkable that we teach people how to be physically fit from the youngest of ages. I mean, when did people here first take their first gym class? Anyone want to shout it out? This is going to be interactive. This is a way of me deflecting. 6 years old, you said? Kindergarten. Yeah. Okay. When did you have your first emotional fitness class? Therapy. We want to prevent that if we can. Therapy can be great. But so it's a no-brainer that we experience emotions throughout our lives. According to some research, we're experiencing some kind of emotional state about 90% of the time that we are awake. If you are like me, you probably experience emotions when you're sleeping too, not always positive ones. And we don't give people science to help navigate those kinds of issues. And that's what that book is all about. It's about how do you take everything we know about how to manage emotions effectively? How do you take that rich science and then translate it for an audience who's curious about how emotions work and equally importantly wants to use it to help them operate a little bit more effectively?
So I'm going to ask you to draw that out a bit more. So what are, and you've really foreshadowed this, but what are some basic misconceptions that people have about their emotions?
Well, where do we start? So one of the big ones is that negative emotions are bad for us. Anyone here like just familiar with that cultural maxim, like, you know, like anxiety, poor anxiety. We vilify anxiety. Does anyone here view anxiety as a friend, as an ally? Okay, two people. See you later. Bye bye. Yeah, I do too. When I think about engagements that I've had, speaking opportunities where I haven't really just kind of like stuck the landing. It's when I had no anxiety beforehand. Anxiety is an emotion that zooms us in on a potential threat, gets us to prepare, and when it's experienced in the right proportions, it can be really, really functional. So I'm of the belief that all emotions are functional if, and this is an important if, they're not experienced too intensely or last too long. Sadness can be functional, right? Like sadness, you encounter a loss, you can't replace it. Sadness motivates us to turn our attention inward, to introspect, make new meaning out of the new, hand of cards that we're playing with. That's useful as long as it doesn't get too deep. So that's one very big misconception. The other really big one is that managing your emotions is hard. It's really hard. There's no question that there are some instances in which managing emotions can be very challenging. You got to roll up your sleeves, engage in practices repeatedly. We know a lot about how those work. But there are also really simple ways to manage your emotions quite effectively. One of my favorite examples of this is music. Who here listens to music? Okay, stupid question, right? Everyone listens to music. Why do you listen to music? Anyone, shout it out. Why do you listen to music? Not a trick question. Okay, too many people all at once. But I'm going to go with the feeling. I heard feeling. You ask people this question, as scientists have, almost 100% of a sample. We survey people in this institute quite a bit, right? Like, when do you get almost 100% of a sample all giving a similar response? People answer the question, why do you listen to music? Because they like the way it makes them feel. It is fundamentally an emotion regulatory pursuit, and research shows that it shifts our emotions within a matter of seconds. And so there are lots of other tools like that, some of which we're already familiar with, but we're not really being strategic about how we use them. So that's another misconception. There's a whole list of myths I go through. So we could keep doing this if you want. We could do more.
I was also just going to add to that Ethan and I are collaborating with a set of colleagues here thinking about the Berlin Philharmonic and why music matters in our lives. And so it actually sort of underscores your point about we gravitate toward things that can potentially help us both regulate, but also help us feel things that in some ways we might shy away from or think that we can't fully embed ourselves in.
Yeah.
It's a license, maybe.
Well, and part of the reason why it's so fun to work with you and at this institute, the collaborative nature of it is there are very, very thick, impenetrable walls that I think have existed between science and the arts. And it's interesting, like you suspend disbelief when you go into the arts if you're a scientist. And it doesn't need to be that way, because we actually know a lot about how the arts can impact us emotionally, and they have for millennia. I mean, here's a little bit of trivia. If you go back in time, you didn't just send soldiers onto the battlefield. You would send soldiers with a full marching band. That's a
great point.
Why, think about this. You're putting soldiers in this incredibly stressful situation. Let's use some music to kind of mellow things out or pump people up. It's a tool.
So that's interesting that you mentioned the term tool, and it's making me think about your points related to emotions as neither good or bad, but really information for us. And so, but I think from a tool perspective, how do we learn how to manage our own mindset so that we use it as information, and again, don't find it repellent in some way that we have to run from it.
Yeah.
But what how do we make certain that we incorporate it into our information set so that it's informing the way we operate and how we interact with others?
Well, I think there are 4 steps. So step 1 is having the awareness that emotions are information and they can be really valuable. Um, Step 2 is having the recognition that sometimes we need to constrain these emotions. We need to manage them. And I don't think we have to do a whole lot of convincing people that at times we need to learn how to manage our emotions. But related to that is a really big issue, which is convincing people that they can actually control their emotions. And that is a problem that I did not anticipate earlier in my career. So if we roll back the clock maybe about 15 years or so, I had just come here as an assistant professor. I start this lab called the Michigan Emotion and Self-Control Lab. We're doing research, really exciting, trying to learn about how emotions work, how people work, and then take those insights to help people. Like, life's pretty good. And then I get an article in a prestigious journal that basically surveyed people on whether they think they can control can you really control your emotions? And about 40% of the sample said no.
That's
so
interesting.
Right?
Wow.
Like, to me, I took this very personally. I viewed it as an existential threat. Like, I've dedicated my life to the emotion and self-control lab, and now half of the sample basically is saying, no, this is a pointless pursuit because you can't control your emotions. Since then, I've encountered a lot of people. The results generalize. Like, lots of people actually don't think you can control your emotions. And so one of the things in the book I try to break down are like, how is that possible? How are 50% of the people clearly just getting it wrong? I mean, I'm right. We can control our emotions. Turns out that's not true. Lots of things I'm wrong about. There's nuance to this question of emotion regulation. And what we've learned is there are facets to our emotional life that are out of our control. Anyone here over the past 1 or 2 weeks experience a thought that popped into your head that maybe led you to feel a little bad about yourself and maybe you feel ashamed to share with someone else? Yeah? Want to put the hands up? Okay. Many of you, those who didn't, are probably maybe not revealing because these are a regular universal phenomenon, these intrusive thoughts. We get thoughts that pop into our head outside of our conscious control, and they elicit emotional reactions. You ever bump up against someone on the street who smells really great and experience an emotional response? It's out of your control. It just happens. You ever bump up against someone who smells really bad and experience an emotional response? You all are so polite. Come on. You never bump up against someone who doesn't smell good? So the point here is that lots of things are happening to us throughout our lives. We don't have control once those emotions are activated. So if you're thinking about that subset of experiences, we don't have control. But if you shift your lens and you think about, well, what happens once those emotions are triggered? Then there are lots of things we can do to alter their trajectory, to turn their volume up or down, to impact how long they last, to maybe switch from one state to another. So a second key step in this process of managing your emotions is simply understanding that you can actually do this. And that's critical because we know from decades of research, if you don't think you can do something, why would you exert any effort to try to do that? This gets into self-efficacy. Then you need to have actual tools. You actually need to know, what are the tools that I can use flexibly to impact my emotions? I could be super motivated to make my muscles really big and lose weight and join the Y, and I walk in there, and if I don't know how any of those machines work, I'm not going to be effective. In fact, I might even harm myself. So you got to know what the tools are, and then you got to start using them. And that's the roadmap.
So one of the things that I kept mulling over as you were speaking is that I might have these tools, but what if the intimate others in my life do not? and I think sometimes that of certain sorts of emotions, and Your mention of self-efficacy reminds me of collective efficacy, this emergent property of social cohesion, informal social control. So I think sometimes at emotions, you can kind of feel a vibe in the room, right? And so what if everybody in your immediate network hasn't read the book and isn't taking in the tools, and how do you then operate, and how does it affect your success at your own regulation?
Great questions. So there are two routes to getting people information that they can benefit from with respect to these kinds of tools. One is to take the direct route, which is to just share these tools with people. Now, you need to be very careful though about doing that. Yeah, let's take like a fictitious family member that we all have. They may not be very good at managing their emotions well. If they don't ask you for help, hey, I've been having I'm just ruminating about this. Like, what can I do? I don't know. It's bothering me. If they don't ask you and you just volunteer that support, research indicates that that has a very good chance of blowing up in your face. Because when you volunteer support, even if you are super well intentioned, even if it's between loved ones, if you volunteer for it and it's not asked, what that communicates to the other person is, to use the technical phrase, you are not capable of handling your own shit. And this violates people's sense of agency, of it threatens their sense of autonomy, of self-efficacy, and we have this strong drive to be self-efficacious. So if a person asks hey, tell me about some of these tools you went to a talk, by all means tell them. If they don't ask, then what you want to do is you want to provide support invisibly. So there's actually a literature on this called the invisible support. What invisible support refers to is getting people resources they can benefit from, but without shining a spotlight on the fact that that is what you are doing. The origins of this research are actually really interesting. There were researchers in New York City who were following couples, one member of whom was studying for the bar exam. This is an incredibly stressful period. And this longitudinal research, what they found was the couples that did worse were instances in which one member of the couple was explicit about offering support. That elicited this defensiveness and reactance. The couples that did best one member provided the support invisibly. So what does that look like concretely? Let's say, my wife is really stressed out about something and she's got a lot on her plate on a particular day. I just do some things to ease the burden. Like if she was going to pick up the groceries, like I do it and I take care of some other things on her plate. I don't do those things and then say, hey, Laura, over dinner, look at the things I did today. Did you notice what I did? And I have a pat on the back. Like you're just doing things, instrumental support to reduce the burden. Let's shift to another situation. Let's say there's someone in my lab who's struggling with their presentation skills. You need to be able to communicate your findings, right? You can't get a job if you can't give a job talk. So before I pull them aside and confront them directly, I've noticed like, we got to up your game a little bit. Here are 3 things I want you to try. Before I take that empathic step, which would still potentially be viewed negatively, what I would do is I would hold a team meeting, a lab meeting where, hey, let's just focus on like best practices for leveling up all of our presentation skills. So let's everyone come prepared to share out 2 things that have really benefited us. What I'm doing there, I'm putting the information out there for the person to potentially pick up, right? So if like I know at home I've got 2 daughters and high school, junior high, emotional calamities are a daily event, right? And the absolute like the last person they want to hear from is yours truly. Like
I'm just guessing.
Nothing of substance to contribute. So what I might do is say to my wife, like, we just we're learning about this stuff in the lab, and we had no idea how just quickly music can shift people's emotions, just a couple of seconds. And like they pick up on that, and then they do those things later. But they will never ever give me any credit whatsoever for that.
They might someday
Uh,
when they write their own books,
maybe,
and they'll thank
maybe,
you, right, in the
yeah.
foreword.
So, but just to close,
Please,
that's the other way you can help people. So for me, like this question you asked in terms of how like doing the research for this book
Yeah.
and more generally research I talk about in this book have impacted me, those are like guideposts I use to navigate relationships I really care about. And for me personally, it's an example of how science is really a guide that I have benefited from.
And that's because you invoked stories of your family, and I know you use personal narrative in the book to motivate different kinds of operational examples. And I'm just wondering, sort of, in some sense, why that technique and how narrative helps us understand sort of broader social phenomenon. So I often think within ISR, we focus on large-scale longitudinal data collection often. And sometimes I think we are reticent to tell stories from those data. And so I'm just interested both in your use of narrative and that personal narrative may even be sort of more powerful in the way that you convey these principles.
So let's talk about narrative, and let's talk about it in two ways. Why I do it, and then also the challenges associated with doing it, which were probably for this book and my last, probably the most difficult challenge I faced when writing these books. So in terms of why I do it, like who here prefers to read compelling stories than result sections? Compelling stories. Okay, most people, but I appreciate those of you who really like the results sections. I lean into that. We tend to prefer reading and hearing stories. We remember stories better. And so this is a very strategic decision. Like my goal with these books is to get science that I think can have impact on society. And in order to do that, you got to pick up the book, number one, and then you've got to read it, and it has to resonate. And so the stories are just a tool to facilitate that transmission of information, transmission of knowledge. There's a whole strategy behind how to select stories, and I learned this when I started working on books. You want to find stories. I've got one story of a nuclear code carrying Navy SEAL, and then I have another story about a mom dealing with a kid who has allergies. And so you want to appeal to lots of different constituents, right? People want to be able to see themselves in different stories. And so I'm very deliberate about representation, which is hard, like 7 chapters, you can't represent all, but really trying to figure out how to not tell the same kind of story over and over again. And then also, like, if a story from my own life I think is relevant, I'm happy to share that. I think that can help humanize an author. So yeah, I study emotion regulation, but very rarely do I struggle with it myself, right? Like, but revealing that too, like we're all human, I think can have useful rhetorical functions. Now, the biggest challenge, and I think this is a challenge when we go into the science, and when I present science, I don't tell the same kinds of stories. I tell I constrain that, is how do you find stories that connect faithfully to the science, that illustrate a principle, but don't distort it in any way.
Or overstate in some sense.
It. And that is a really, really hard thing to do, to find that kind of connection.
Yeah, because I do think the stories are an important hook.
Yeah.
Right? We want to read that we want to identify. So on your point about appealing to different constituencies, you want to see yourself in some sense.
Absolutely.
In some of these spaces. But how do we think about, again, narrative examples as motivating some of the larger social phenomena we're observing in the kinds of research we also do here? So I like thinking about this intersection. It's very challenging.
It's really hard. And I think one of the interesting positions I've been in as someone who identifies first and foremost as a card-carrying scientist who does the lab work continuously. But then I'll take some breaks every now and again, and I'll go out there beyond, the lab into the world, talk to people, podcasts, events like this, but without scientists. And um, I'm a minority in those spaces. I'm a minority in contexts that should be populated by science-based information. So if you take like the wellness space where some of this work gets distributed, you've got the majority of it. People are off like armchair theorizing about how to help people manage their emotions, their physical health, their well-being. It's not grounded in science. And so I think that's something that we need to be more mindful of because, as a friend says, like science should be our source code, right? Like
Yeah, I love
that
that.
is the
Yeah.
driving force that should be guiding people, I think. And I think we could do that better.
So on doing that better, I'd love to take a moment to talk about the Institute for Mental Fitness. And proudly, ISR is, as I mentioned, helping to incubate this work. But it feels like you could occupy the space that you just described with rigorous science in a way that can appeal, that translation could be central to that. And I'm just interested in your vision for the Institute for Mental Fitness.
Well, first of all, I could say we're so grateful that ISR has really stuck its neck out to the extent that it has one.
It's worth it.
to support this institute. Well, let me maybe share with the group the origins
That'd be great.
of this institute, where the idea came from. A couple of years ago, I got an email from a few donor alums, individuals who care deeply about this institution and retire, semi-retired, just want to give back. And they're on this next big idea committee. And someone gave them my name and said, hey, we're on this next big idea committee. Want to pick your brain about what we can do at Michigan that could be big. And I had been thinking a while about the fact that there are institutions around the country and beyond that are synonymous with certain topics, like MIT engineering, Stanford entrepreneurship. And then I thought, like, well, well-being, mental health. And I would keep on like uttering those phrases in my head, but the institution that came up didn't pair with it. And so like I just floated out there, hey guys, like why don't we make Michigan to mental health and well-being what Stanford is to entrepreneurship? This is a timeless and universal struggle with all indicators pushing us in the wrong direction. We actually have amazing talent here right now distributed across the campus that we're siloed. We don't talk to each other. And so that pitch landed, and then we started working and shopping this idea around initially locally to different schools, and then to administrators above, executive officers, president, and we now have some support to incubate this Institute for Mental Fitness, where the goals are twofold. First and foremost, guided by science, substantially move the needle on global suffering. And by global suffering, I don't mean just clinical forms of anxiety and depression. I mean the everyday problems of living that all of us struggle with at times. We've learned a lot about how to help people deal with those situations, but we need to go much further. So we think of this as a moonshot effort to innovate here, come up with new science-based integrative solutions, cutting across lots of different areas to really, really help society. And then in the process of doing, make Michigan the global epicenter for this kind of work. So it's a very go blue orientation here. And there are three different buckets of activity that we're trying to erect. Number one, research. That's where this all, I think, lives or dies. Like, can we figure out new models to really innovate here in an area where although there's been incremental progress, we have not seen the moonshot occur in terms of helping people substantially improve their ability to manage emotions on a daily basis. Education, how do we take the science that we already have and start getting it out there to people? training a new generation of a science-based workforce, if you will, that understands how emotions work, how to manage them. And then application, really leaning into disseminating this information to the world so that we're not just listening to armchair theorists who are often really well-intentioned, but sometimes provide messaging that leads us astray. And so that's what the Institute is doing. And we are, I think, 7 weeks into effect, and making lots of progress, but we're really excited about doing it. And we're excited to do it here at ISR because ISR is historically a place that brings people from different areas together to create these collaborative groups. And so those of us who are here, some of the people are in the audience, we are pinching ourselves about how fortunate we are to be both doing it and doing it with you.
And I will say on behalf of ISR that, yeah, we are thrilled to be able to partner in this way. And I think, we want to make certain that we are engaged in science that is innovative. I feel in some sense a responsibility to do that. We are now in our 76th year. We're one of the few social science institutes in the world that combines so many different disciplines and so many different methodological approaches. And I feel like we're at the ready to really think about science at the forefront. And, I've shared this with many of you in the room, but I always had this imagining that, project officers from NSF and NIH would all get on a plane and fly out here and see what we're doing and then write the RFA. Like, yeah, instead of our responding to it, we're defining it. And so I feel like the work that Ethan is envisioning really helps us to define a new science and that we'll be leading.
And like that is an outcome that I would feel comfortable like putting on the 5-year plan. So one of the things that we're trying to do here is really think outside the box, partnering not only with scientists and folks from this university, but also experts from other industries who have other kinds of expertise, to shake things up a little bit in ways that we hope are disruptive and productive. And so one example of this with respect to the program officers coming here and then writing the RFA, we are currently in conversation with folks from TED to help us produce an annual conference, several days on these topics that is multidisciplinary in the widest usage of that term, bringing together scientists, public health experts, advocates, athletes, and so forth to shine a spotlight on the advances that are occurring here and elsewhere in ways that will get society's attention. And I think that is a really important thing that we need to do more of, which is like take the beautiful, wonderful science that we are discovering, but do more with it. And so like if we're successful, I think like the Surgeon General and their equivalent around the world, they will have it on their calendar to come here every year for this annual event, including the NIMH officers as well.
Yeah. Like that.
They should just give us pipelines for free grants, actually, too. That would be wonderful.
It's interesting you talk. I will close with this question, but you mentioned grants, and I mentioned NSF and NIH, and of course we're in this unique period historically in terms of the relationship between the academy and the federal government to engage in new science and support new science. So, how might you suggest we regulate our emotions around this pivotal moment and think about ways that we can continue to be committed to and engaged in our science?
Well, so one of the things we've learned, and this is some work that we did in my lab during COVID, is there are no one-size-fits-all solutions.
Yes.
I really, really practice this myself. There are no single strategies that work for all people in all situations. In general, between 3 and 5 strategies for any kind of significant emotional disturbance you're dealing with. What do I do in these circumstances? I have removed the New York Times from my phone.
Okay.
So actually, some of this no one size fits all solutions, the top predictor of daily emotional distress in several diary studies, news consumption.
That's
I mean,
interesting.
I used to just check my every time I'm in between a meeting, I just look at the times, and I learned that in recent times, um, that really sent me astray in a way that it had never before done.
Mm-hmm.
So I've now modified my digital environment to reduce the cues
Mm-hmm.
that elicit emotions that I have sometimes some trouble dealing with. Um, I also would advocate like looking at the bigger picture, recognizing how things will change eventually, like guaranteed circumstances will change. They always do. So broadening one's perspective, refocusing on purpose, what finds meaning, a little bit of avoidance can be a very good thing.
Interesting.
That's another myth I try to dispel. Like we often hear that
Yeah.
avoidance is toxic. Au contraire. Like it can be very, very useful to strategically avoid. And I've gotten pretty good at that. So
Yeah. Yeah. I hope we'll continue to have that
yes,
conversation.
yes,
So I like that
yeah.
idea. Um, so I think it's time to turn things over to all of you and hear what questions you have for Ethan. I think we have some microphones. Yep, Anna has one. Oh, great. Leanne, please start us out.
Mm,
Good question.
mm. Yeah. Well, I actually am avoiding that entirely by leaving the country. So I think that's one solution you might want to, if you can, avail yourself of. Um, I think in those situations, which are incredibly common, um, there are a couple of angles you can look at things from. So sometimes like getting people to agree to not go into certain topics can be just very, very helpful. I mean, that is a form of avoidance, but it can be useful. Like I've done that with certain members of my family who love, love, love to talk about politics in a way that it's hard not to be automatically triggered. And so before we even get into that situation, I have had conversations like, look, I'm really looking forward to seeing you. It's been so long. I want to catch you up on everything. One favor, like, let's just not go here. It just doesn't end up, I think we can agree, it doesn't usually pan out well. And so you're ahead of time preemptively trying to like shape the battlefield, so to speak, and make it not a battlefield. So that's one thing you can do. Um, if you get triggered, um, forming what we call an implementation intention. So if this happens, if I get triggered, they seduce me into then, and have your strategy lined up and ready to go so it's automatic. So I have another family member. I can see their face in my mind's eye right now. We're being recorded, so I'm not telling anyone who it is. I see their image. If they say many things, I will just remind myself, look, I love this person. I don't get to see them that much. And I'm going to anchor on that. And so taking it up that level can be helpful too. So I would try to like game out ahead of time. What are the triggers that might set you off? And then have a plan for how to deal with them. This actually it's a research-based technique. It's called mental contrasting with implementation intentions. Bit of a mouthful. It's been rebranded WHOOP as an acronym. I think that's a lot better. Uh, Helps kids as young as age 5 all the way up to people across the lifespan pursue their goals. It's also what the Navy SEALs use to be successful when they go on deployment. And they've got to prepare themselves for different contingencies that might set them astray. Other questions folks have? Yeah.
I'm really excited about this institute, and I think it's very timely and also really long overdue. I remember being an undergrad at Wisconsin when Richie Davidson was having trouble getting any of the socio-emotional learning interventions in schools, and then I went on to spend time in the Positive Psychology Center at UPenn, where I could see what that actually looked like, and the whole U.S. Army took on mental fitness. Their comprehensive social fitness training where they implemented mental health, and so that was a cool, niche area where that was implemented. But I think like you talked about, this type of science needs to be in so many different contexts where it's not already. And so I'm wondering, you have some key science communication strategies that are top on your list for getting these ideas out there more broadly.
Well, so one thing we want to do, so first of all, you should come on, hang out at the Institute. Sounds like we know a lot of the same people. So our strategy here first is to identify the communities that we want to focus on initially. And we've got 4: organizations, schools, education, sports, and healthcare. And that covers a broad swath of the terrain. And then what we want to do is we don't want to reinvent the wheel when it comes to communications. And so building off the infrastructure we have at Michigan, like using that as a starting point, but then also partnering with folks in other industries to think about, well, like why was Apple so successful at marketing the iPhone? Like, what were the principles that they use? And you know what? Like, who ran that campaign? Like, I don't know, we may not be able to afford Johnny Ives, but you might be able to get someone else. And so we've already initiated those kinds of conversations about going outside of the traditional walls that keep us in academia to create unique partnerships to really disseminate this work effectively and efficiently. Other questions? We'll do a sweep, that's all. We're gonna start back there, yeah.
I have a question more in depth. Can you regulate your emotions without regulating your atmosphere and or environment? And if so, can you regulate or self-regulate without regulating the environment to produce a desired outcome or emotional state?
So this question comes up a lot. And sometimes there is what I think of as a false distinction between you can either, like some people say you can just regulate yourself, and other people say, and it's all about self-regulation, other people say it's all about the systems, the structure, and that's the only way you can really get regulation. My philosophy here is that we don't have to choose, that both of those are relevant. And in fact, when we're building a curriculum now to teach people about mental fitness, there are 3 pillars to that curriculum. There's self-regulation, there's group-based processes, how do you interact with other people, and then there are more structural level factors. And all of those different levels are relevant to being effective at regulation. They're also interconnected. So when you say, like, does your regulation or lack have implications for the surroundings? Absolutely. There's this phenomenon of emotional contagion. There's beautiful research which shows that emotions spread like wildfire.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
Within a matter of seconds among groups. And so how you show up in either direction can directly impact those people around here. If you've ever, when I used to teach the intro to social psych class, like I feel bad saying, that's a long time ago. Decades ago, one of my favorite lessons was to play a really funny sitcom clip without the laugh reel that, like, the audience, like the piped in laughter. It's not funny. Like, no one laughs. And then you play it with the kind of piped in laughter, and everyone is like, ha 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 ha. That's the fact that we're a social species and our emotions spread really quick. So you guys should all laugh when I say things. It'll make me feel better. See, just worked. Thank you, Kate.
Right. I'm right in there.
Okay, there was a question there. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you about somebody else's book.
Sure.
Lisa Barrett Feldman's How Emotions Are Made, which kind of plays out a picture of emotions as a social construct and one that you could even shape your own and have a multitude of emotions, but taking kind of regulation to another level.
Yes.
Any feedback on that?
Yes. So I know Lisa and her work well, and the first chapter of my book, I think, I actually forget what the title was, but it was about emotions and what they are, and it was actually the hardest chapter to write. I mean, it's pretty astounding as someone who's like studied emotions for 25 years. Like, what's the chapter on what is an emotion? Like, turns out scientists don't agree on how to answer that question. There's a lot of debates, and Lisa is the champion of one view that is quite different from many other people in the field. So Lisa's view is a more constructionist view that we, no two emotional experiences are the same. Culture plays a profound role in shaping the experiences we have, as do the words we use to reflect on our experiences, which is very different from other folks who endorse a model called like the basic emotion theory. That, has anyone here seen Inside Out? Yeah, that's the other view. You got anger, you got anxiety, you got sadness. So thank you, Pixar, makes my explanation more easy. There's interesting evidence to support both of those perspectives. It is a true debate. We have not determined who is correct. Here's what a lot of people miss, though, when they read the articles that, that's like a boxing match and the two camps are fighting. Those two camps agree on like 90% about what emotions are, and they disagree in a few other points that get a lot of the attention. So, emotions are responses to things in the world that are meaningful to us, and we imagine or we experience. They elicit a loosely coordinated response of things happening within us, like shaping our thought patterns, our bodies respond in particular ways, motor behaviors. Which one comes first? Does one cause the other? Decades of research dispute like, I'm right, you're wrong. But the idea that we experience emotions in this context for a particular reason, and because they're functional, that's pretty unanimous. And so that's what I anchored on in the book. Like, what do we all agree on? But her book's a great read, and if you haven't read it and you're interested in the space, you should read it. Other questions? Emotions Institute, anything else?
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. So I study family caregivers of older adults with dementia. And so I was kind of curious about your perspective on emotional regulation from the caregiver perspective.
Yeah.
An older adult might not have the same memories anymore. And also for the person with cognitive impairment.
Yes, and yes. I mean, these are populations that desperately need support. The emotional labor involved in caring for another human being, especially that one that you are attached to in some ways emotionally, is unbelievably demanding. And we throw people in these circumstances, or not we, life throws people in these circumstances and doesn't really give much guidance for how to navigate them. It can make things particularly challenging to manage those situations because the person who's being taken care of, in your case, like people who are suffering from dementia, they don't have the cognitive apparatus to operate in a normal, healthy way. And that creates even more demand. So I think, there are occupations that have been quantified, like their level of emotional labor. You're talking about one, like service providers, like flight attendants. That's another big one. Turns out being a flight attendant is not easy. Like, people are pretty stressful on a plane. I think in an ideal world, we would have pipelines to those industries in which we are continuously funneling science-based insights, easily understandable, for how to help them optimize the way they manage their emotional lives. They come to Ann Arbor, come to our courses, we could get it to them asynchronously using tech. And I think that would be doing a great service to the world and having impact. Other questions that folks have?
May I chime in with another question? People are mentioning their own. So Sarah's comments lead me to think about grief. And how do we think about grief in the context of emotional regulation? Because it can, in my own experience at least, hit one at certain moments and I don't have great priors.
Yeah.
That, somehow being in the grocery store reminds me of a story about my mother. And then I have a hard time calibrating that. How do you think about grief in all of this?
Well, grief is an extreme emotion regulatory challenge. And there are lots of myths that surround grief as well. And so George Bonanno, who's one of the top people in the world in terms of the study of grieving, he's got a great book that came out a couple of years ago. One of the most powerful messages of that book is that, are people here familiar with like the Kubler-Ross like stages of grief? Yeah, not true. Like, not true. Like, you
Yeah.
look at the data, he has followed people who are grieving. And he has these beautiful graphs where he shows there are different trajectories, different, and there are some like, like 4 or 5 different ones that people kind of fall into that profile. Some people just get better like right away. Other
Interesting.
people, it's like a different shaped function. And like, how useful would that be to you at the outset of your grieving process to know, hey, there isn't just one
Right.
pathway. Like, one of the things we're looking at in our lab right now is this process of normalization. One of the things that people really struggle with, whether it's grief or anxiety or betrayal, is you feel like you are all alone.
Yeah.
And that's not a good feeling, right? In part because we're a social species and we want to blend in and be similar in many ways. And so if you're defying the standard, everyone grieves in these 5 stages, but you're not, that just compounds the problem. So that's one response I have to the grief. The other is that it's a protracted process, and it's characterized by what some have called as sudden gains, where you're just debilitated, and all of a sudden, boom, you get better. You kind of snap out of it. We see that happening in many therapeutic contexts too. We don't yet understand how that works. And that, I think, is like a very important challenge. Like, that's what we should be doing, and hopefully we'll be doing with this institute, is being able to answer those questions.
It's helpful. It looks.
One more. Yeah. There's someone else. But I'll ask it. I'll jump right in. So I'm curious for your perspective on this. So I've analyzed numerous experience sampling data that my career, and one thing that continues to astound me is the non-negligible amount of people who will not report anything but a 0 for every discrete negative emotion. Most remarkably, in the National Study of Daily Experiences, which is over 20 years, there are 30 people who did not report a single negative emotion. So I'm wondering what you think is going on there. And this is sort of feeds to a broader question about, even the people who do report some, it's really low. Like, it's hard to get people to report any sort of variance at all in negative emotion. And so I'm curious about your take on what's going on there and why. Because people are having them, right? But they're so hesitant to report on them.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because that's what I was going to say, is like, they're lying. I mean, if 0 negative emotion, like, I've never seen it, and I think we've got really good reason to not expect that to ever be the case. Like, there would likely be lots of really significant problems associated with those individuals in terms of their ability to successfully navigate life. Is there variability? Like, absolutely. I think our methodologies are not optimal. I do a lot of experience sampling research. I love it. For those of you not aware of experience sampling involves, it's using technology, say a cell phone, to text people throughout the day with like short questionnaires. More or less, that's how it looks. And the value of it is, rather than bringing people into the lab and asking them to retrospect on things, you're just sampling life as it's lived. It's not perfect, right? It's not a perfect methodology. And I think we are now, with technology, both not just AI-driven technology, but also mobile, kind of biometric scanners, we are going to be learning, we're going to have a lot more capability of triangulating on people's emotional experience than we have ever before. There was an article just a couple of days ago in the Times about what are we going to do about the fact that in the not too distant future, we're going to be able to read people's thoughts. That may sound like science fiction to some of you here. I don't think it is. I think we will be in that position soon. And so we're going to be able to see what these people who say 0, negative emotion ever, what they're really feeling very soon. And I think we should be at the forefront of that kind of work. And, RCGD is doing a lot of that now. So with Rich.
And you will help lead that work through the Institute for Mental Fitness. And so if people are interested in learning more, if they.
Yeah, send an email. We are looking to build a team and extend this in lots of different directions. And this is the family, ISR. So we welcome the family members.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking Ethan Kross for a fascinating conversation, and I hope more to come.
Yeah, thank
as the
you.
work unfolds. And go ahead to Literati. Hopefully they have more books.
Tell them they need to stock up.
Right, exactly. Yeah. It was fun. We should go on the road.